You're listening to Oh My Health, There Is Hope podcast.
When your heart is aching and your world is shaking, don't give up. No, don't give up.
Hello and welcome to Oh My Health, There Is Hope, the podcast. I'm your host, Jana Short. And today I'm so excited. We are here with a very special guest, Elizabeth Harris. Elizabeth is the author of What's Wrong with My Child and America is Infected. She is currently pursuing a master's in molecular medicine. Her graduate degree is in biology and chemistry, and she has a postgraduate training from the American College of Sports Medicine. Elizabeth Harris waged a hard-fought battle to get to the root of her family's medical issues, especially the strange disease that hijacked her firstborn son's life. Using her science, education background, and her experience as a successful entrepreneur, Elizabeth exposed the mysterious bacteria that is not only behind her son's disease, but is also a key contributor to a myriad of maladies in America. Today, Elizabeth and her expert wellness team at What's Wrong Wellness have helped clients from around the world regain their health and get back to what they love doing. And oh my gosh, I'm so excited to get to talk to this incredible lady and to hear all the amazing stuff she's going to just put out there for us today. Welcome, Elizabeth.
Thank you. Thank you. It's so good to be here.
Well, one of the things we ask all of our guests to do is to share a story of hope at the beginning of every podcast, because I believe our journeys literally are our purposes in life. And when we share those, we help others get through their journeys. So do you want to share your story of hope with us?
Absolutely. So, it started in 2010 or a little bit before 2008, actually, with my symptoms. And, the stress and the workload that I had being a busy spa owner. I had 4 children by then, 2 biological, 2 adopted. And so I was managing the spa, and I'd also started a consulting company. And so I just thought that the tingling in my hands was stress or working too much or, those things that we always think they are. A couple years later, my son came down with strep throat, and a couple weeks later after that, came down with some very bizarre symptoms. He had OCD, basically went into psychosis over the course of a few days. So we ended up going into the hospital, and long story short, strep had caused this autoimmune disease. We spent 4 years fighting through it, finally came to the conclusion, and we've all recovered. And now it is time to go out and help everyone else.
I love that. Tell us a little bit about what it is that you found, because this is what I'm dying to hear. Like, I want you to just be real with it.
Be real with it. Well, after 7 years of agony, being involved with the juvenile detention center, honestly, we'd gone to 50 doctors between the two of us. We'd gone to specialists all over the country. He'd had IVIG, this and that, psych meds. I was having nerve blocks, pain meds, Cymbalta and Lyrica. And eventually I just thought, they don't know. They just don't know. And I pulled all these, strategies and realized that I was going to have to do it on my own, which is the scary proposition when things are this serious and you're close to losing your child because DCS wants to take them away because you can't control them. And I'm sick myself. So I decided to just get his medical records since birth. And I started to read them. And PANDAS is a misdirected immune response. But with my education from 25 years ago, I just kept thinking to myself, what is autoimmune anyway? Like an immune system, fights a foreign pathogen typically. So there's not an infection, or is there infection? The only clue I had was that there was Microplasma Pneumonia. He had shown that on labs at one point in time. So I put all this together, reading the medical records, and I watched, and this was so fascinating, but it took me 3 days to get through them all. And so when he was very, very young, he had ear infections, pneumonia, bronchitis, and he'd been treated with antibiotics, hospitalized. But by the time he was 2 and 3, he kind of started to outgrow it, if you will. But I noticed that by the time he was like 4, 5, and 6, he started to get fidgety. By the time he was in 3rd grade, he was diagnosed with ADHD. 4th grade, it was anxiety because he had some breathing disorder. And I just thought, this thing that he had as a baby never really went away. it has stayed there. So then I start thinking, is it resistant? You know, what's happening? Because by the 5th grade OCD and this pandas, and it just all did not make sense. It was like a slow misdirection of the immune response, and he no longer got the physical symptoms of infection. So the only clue I had was Microplasma pneumonia. So I started looking around, investigating that organism, and there was nothing here in the United States, zero research available. But in India, I'm like reading about it, and I'm like, okay, what's going on? I mean, honestly, it just felt pretty odd because I've been researching for like 2 years now, and there was so much on everything else. So I found one article, 2004, from a researcher down in Alabama, and I called him. And I just said, hey, I need to learn more about Microplasma pneumonia. It says it's like community-acquired pneumonia, but it feels like much more than that in our home. And so I read his work, and he had alluded to the fact that, you know, it can cause autoimmunity because it can actually infect the cell. So there's a P37 adhesion protein that actually adheres to the cellular membrane, infects the cell, but leaves some of its antigen on the cell wall. So the antibodies that are created are actually created against the antigens of mycoplasma and host cell proteins, which was fascinating to me because all I'd gotten for the last 3 years was molecular mimicry. And I was like, I don't get that. Like, how would an antibody just get confused? But this made so much sense. And so when I called him, he said, I no longer research that organism. If you think you have this infection, go back to Vanderbilt. Well, I guess he didn't know we'd been there, but I'd already been there and one of those doctors out and had crazy label all over my chart. So I was not going to go back there. I'd hammered them, but I thought I never called the researchers. I never called the research department. So I picked up the phone, and this is like, you know, the mindset. It's just like, you just keep trying. It's just, you don't give up. And I called and I just said, hey, I need to talk to someone about intracellular organisms, specifically mycoplasma. The lady that answers the phone says, we don't have anyone here that researches that organism. Do you mean chlamydia pneumonia? I Google it real quick and I'm like, oh, that's intracellular too. Yes, I need to talk to him. So she forwards me to him. I mean, and what are the chances that this researcher like actually picks up the phone? Like, that in and of itself just gave me so much hope, because when he answered, I said, no, this is random. And I know that like, there's nobody that researches mycoplasma here, but he stopped me right there. And he said, there's only one man in this country that studies this organism. It's Dr. Garth Nicholson. And I thought, so I Google him and I look it up, and I recognized his name. And see, this is the whole thread that you just can't deny, because back when I was in cell biology, he is a scientist that discovered the phospholipid of the cell membrane. So, I mean, I recognized him as a very credible scientist. And so when I read and started reading the research on his site, I was more open-minded because I knew him. And as I clicked through this website, I started reading about this experimentation, if you might want to call it that had taken place in the Texas prison systems back in the 80s, late 70s and 80s. And it was the Department of Justice, Baylor University, the Army Pathology Lab, the Department of Defense. And they had taken an organism, Microplasma fermentans, that lives in the soil, and it's pretty benign. But what they had done is weaponized it. And so they had spliced in some of the tryptosans from like HHV6, which is roseola in a child. That's 10 to the 6th strain. 10 to the 7th strain is the mycoplasma with the EBV, the mono inside of it, spliced in. And so then 10 to the 10th power was the mycoplasma with the some of the proteins from the HIV-1 envelope. So they also, there's bacteria that can withstand volcanoes, the heat of a volcano. So you can take parts of those, part of those genes and move them over and then create an organism that can't be killed by fevers. And so as I read, I mean, honestly, I just knew in my spirit that we had contracted this, because they tested the organism in the Texas death row inmates. But what they didn't consider, the microbiologist did, but the Army guy didn't, is that when you infect someone with an organism, Mycoplasma fermentans, in the same host, there also might be Mycoplasma pneumonia lying there latent. And so when you have two organisms in the same species like that, they can transfer genetically their most virulent genes. And I mean, that's really common. And so what ended up happening was that these prisoners had co-infections that became weaponized. And then now this becomes airborne and it gets out into the little community of Huntsville, Texas. And I don't know how long it took, a couple of years before the rate of MS, ALS, and rheumatoid arthritis was 5,000% higher in this little town of Huntsville than it was across the entire United States. So this is where it started for us, I know, because in 2003, and, you know, I'm reading, how is this transmitted? What are the symptoms? So you can either contract it casually, which is like 24 kind of casual exposures with someone that might have it, or you can get it directly, which in our case, that's what happened because we had an ex-brother-in-law. He's since passed, and he was down there at a rehab down in Texas in 2002. And he just went for like kind of like a weed and alcohol problem. But apparently the Texas prison system transferred in and out of there. And so we let him come live with us, you know, back in 2003, trying to do the right thing, help him get on his feet. But I remember that probably after a week or two, we all got just deathly sick, like so sick. And my little son that developed pandas was 1.5 or 2. And I remember his little lips were blue. He could barely move. He was so dehydrated. It took about 9 days for us to even come back to life. And my biological daughter, the only one that didn't get just like hammered with it, got pleurisy. So we all 4 have this and we don't even know what it is. And a few weeks later, we came down with these huge boils. Well, back in 2003, nobody knew what MRSA was. So we end up with these huge, painful boils, not knowing that they're MRSA. So we contract like literally everything right then and there. And over the years, my ex-husband had developed chronic fatigue, and I thought he was lazy. I just thought he was being lazy. And so I'm furious. I speed up. And I like start going faster and faster, do more business, invent more things. Both of my kids had different paths. And I noticed that the difference that I recognized not across the board is that like with the history of a lot of strep pneumo, ear infections and strep throat, it tends to be this, and without it tends to be more depression. And so anyway, of course, it took about 3 days for me to accept the fact that this was a possibility, because what would we do about that? Like what would we do about something that was created? There's no treatment for. So he did have a protocol on his website, and it was like years of antibiotics, like just rounds of them. So I start reading it, and I'm reading it, and I'm doing the research. I'm like, well, what if I'm wrong? What if we don't really have this? So I kept reading, and I knew my son had tested positive for that. But I mean, that could have been, walking pneumonia. People get that. I didn't want to just jump in full force, but we had done a $10,000 genetics test. He didn't even have a single gene for any of his 27 diagnoses. And on top of that, my adopted daughter, who we brought into our home, and she was just as docile and kind as you'd want to ever, see in a child, especially one that's adopted. And so she had, over the past year, started coming down with anxiety, a high heart rate, some weight loss, insomnia. Of course, I didn't put any of this together. And it was this particular summer that I was looking into all this when she started acting horrible. Oppositional defiance disorder, that's a symptom of pandas. She starts slamming the door, screaming, "I hate you." And I'm like, what? Have you seen him do this? Like, why are you doing this? A couple of days after that, she comes and leans in down to me and shows me this big boil behind her ear. And I'm just like, I mean, it's like I was having softballs thrown at my head, because everything I'd heard, this was so opposite of what I'd heard. And so I just thought, I'm going to trust myself, and I'm going to advocate for myself. And what is my strategy here? So I take her into her doctor, and I'm like, can we give her antibiotics for this boil she has? And can we also culture it? Because I'm thinking that might be a clue for this other. he went in culturing, which really bothered me, but gave her the antibiotics. And within like a week, the boil went down and so did her attitude. And I just thought, unbelievable. So I'm starting to like believe what I'm seeing. And so when I read this information from him, I'm determined to get these tests. Like I'm like, could this be what we all have? Maybe. So we went to several doctors. Nobody would give us this test, which I was like, this is so weird. It's just a nasopharyngeal swab. So I have this idea because I learned that if you have it, your pets can get it. And that I'm like thinking, is this why all of our dogs have died like this kind of early-ish? And so I think back to the year before when we had adopted a new dog named Buzz. He's actually out in the house right now. This is 7 years ago. We brought him home with us. Within the first 2 weeks, he starts coughing and hacking and reverse sneezing. I mean, it was just awful. I'm thinking, he's brought something from the pound. No, we can't have him here. So I rush him to the vet. And I'm like, you've got to make sure he doesn't have anything because it'll get my son sick. This is my thinking at the time. Well, he checked for all the doggy diseases and he didn't have any. I said, well, please, he gave him some antibiotics anyway. And believe it or not, he gave him hydrocodone. I was like, for what? That's for the coughing in dogs now. So a year went by and I kid you not, the dog had gone crazy. He had started having abdominal tics. His pupils were huge, running up and down the house. So as I'm reading all this, I'm like, wait a minute, maybe it's in our dog because I can't get another doctor to agree with me. So I take the dog over to the vet, tell him a little bit of the story. And he's like, don't get your hopes up. Your dog, he does not have this. And I'm like, okay, that's fine. Then you could just put me in your crazy box like everybody else has. So he does the test and sends it off and calls me a week later. And he's like, I don't even know how to tell you this, but Buzz is positive for Microplasma Pneumonia. And at that point, I just thought, oh my gosh, okay, now how am I going to get 3 or 4 years worth of antibiotics? Because it wasn't just one, it's like 12. And I've been knocking down doors just to get a few for my son with pandas. So there he went, just trying to find it. I did eventually find a source and ordered them. It was like the last of the funding that I had because I put so much into legal and medical. And I thought, I'm either going to make my next house payment or I'm going to take this road. And I just put it all in. And we committed, ordered them all, lost the house, moved into a little apartment, was able to keep the business. And we just started following the protocol as best we could. And I wish I would have had somebody to guide me through that because there was so many ups and downs to it. And so I always thought, if we ever make it out of this alive, I'm going to circle back and help the people that, would never know this and they would lose their children. And so we all ended up recovering. I found several doctors and medical professionals that now believe it. But to be honest with you, when I saw that it was working, I got very angry for a while. And that's when I wrote America's Infected with a huge swastika on the cover. So 450 pages. I was like, no, I want all the science in here because I had recorded every doctor's visits, like back in college when I would do that. I come home and transcribe them and try to learn, and so I just had all that information and I wrote my first book and a huge bibliography. Then I came to the next publisher and they were like, so I cut half of it.
I love it.
Like, the whole time I'm like, you can't cut that. People need to understand what IVIG is not anti-infectious. And she's like, no, we don't. And I'm like, fine. So we have a book now. I mean, it reads great. She was right, and so I could not believe because they tried to put me in certain categories. And I said, no, I want to go. I want to go all in with this because it's true. I've seen it now in 200 to 300 kids, adults, families. I had the privilege of working with so many people with different diagnoses using this protocol. And many of them have, and I'm just like, so that's where we are today. We started a wellness center, and I know that we can't give antibiotics to the whole country. So I think I found a close second, which is targeted transfer factors. So we use research nutritionals. We use a Zyto scanner. I programmed it with 1,600 stressors, and it's just, how can this be? But I think that the tide is turning. People are opening their minds up to these types of concepts, because when I went into the categories, I went into, I think, medical diagnoses, medical testing, I don't remember, and child psychiatry. And like, I don't know how it happened, but after a couple of days, it was number one in the new releases for child psychiatry. So I just pray that it continues, the information continues to get out, because my mission is not necessarily to like build a huge clientele. I'm the wellness center is for people, to help people that can't get help anywhere else and are totally desperate, just for like a safe place for them to have something. But my mission is more to educate researchers and medical providers and to open their minds up to this science. So the website's got 400 links and research articles, and I've tried to break it down for moms under key concepts. So that's where we are today.
I love your website. And my husband's a veterinarian, so I cannot wait till he gets home, because there's not a whole lot of things that you can pass back and forth between species. There are some things, though, that you can. So I think that is fascinating. But for those of us who are listening, who might be having kids, by the way, I've had that crazy label put on me many times when I kept asking questions, and I wasn't comfortable with the quick RX they were handing me or the response they were giving me. And it got to be to the point where they just thought I was crazy. I always prove them wrong, which is not the fun thing to do, right? Proving them wrong, that I really am sick and here it is. But I know that people give up hope, especially when fighting for themselves. If I were fighting for my kid, I'd be pounding down that door just like you were. But when it's ourselves that we're going to battle for, we are more quiet and subdued, and we'll just take it. But you do something to one of my kids and look out, I will be camping out on your doorstep with an army. So for those moms who are out there, like, how do they contract? Is it always through getting Microplasma Pneumonia? Is it once they get it and they think they've gone through that and it's gone, and all of a sudden there's these symptoms that keep following after that event? Like, what does that look like? What are they looking for their parents? Because one of the things I've noticed, I've raised 4 children and I have 7 grandchildren. And one of the things I've noticed is all these labels we now have for kids, and it's always behavioral labels. And these kids become these labels, right? And I'm wondering, when did this happen? Like, we used to have a label for the kids at school when I was a little kid. It was called BRAT. They were just being a brat, and they grew out of it. They needed a nap or a timeout. But now there's actual things affecting our beautiful children's psyche, their health, their well-being. And it's like an epidemic. Like, I've noticed that every kid has some sort of label on them now. So what can parents be looking for? And maybe they're not getting the answers, or something isn't setting right in their gut, because with your voice and the studies you've done and the masses of the moms who are going to step up and say, wait, we want answers too, that's when we're going to start seeing change. So that little ripple effect you're putting out in the world is so powerful when other people hear it and get on board with it. So what can we be looking for in our kids?
Well, I mean, I would always strongly encourage you to write down any physical symptoms. Just don't think the biggest thing I hear is like, oh, my kid never gets sick. Well, yes, they do. They're just not having the physical symptoms like somebody else might have with it. So I would get a list of like childhood infections, because I've chosen to make my platform on Mycoplasma pneumonia, but there's other strains of Mycoplasma. Streptococcus pneumonia has become resistant in many cases. And so, nasal problems. And the thing is like the psych meds suppress the immune system. That's how they work. And so, you can manage this. If you have a child that has like kind of a mild case of ADHD, I don't think I would go to the great lengths of doing what I did. But if you have a child that's like, they're trying to pin schizophrenia on, or they're talking about like sociopathic, borderline. And the thing is like, you've got to learn where these words lead next, because they can mention something and then you've just got to get out off the psych route, because oppositional defiance disorder. And it's like, it's shocking. The second time that my son got strep, overnight, I'm not going to do what you tell me to do. And I'm just like, and there was so much parent shaming. And if I hadn't got into this, with a pretty high level of self-confidence, I don't think I would have made it, because the school is saying it's behavioral, the pediatrician saying it's behavioral. Where do you go? And so I would just get on the website. If you have a child that you are concerned about or have a gut feeling about, just email me. Let's go through it together. Let me try to help, like, come up with, I mean, I don't charge for anything like that. So it's like, okay, let's look at the doctors in your area. Where have you been? Let's do it like a quick intake. Let me just give you just a little bit of guidance. And so that's where I would start, because there's so, like you said, I mean, I've been obsessed with it, for lack of a better word, for 10 years. I mean, I wake up at 6 a.m. and I'm like, I wonder if H. pylori also is found in, so I'm just like at that level. So I've got all that information here so they don't have to do it. They're not going to be
love
alone.
it. I want you to tell people where they can connect with you. Where can they get that intake form? Where can they find all this stuff?
At what'swrongwellness.com. You can go there. I mean, we're working a little more on the accessibility, but it's a great site full of information. Just click on the intake form, just fill out a little bit of information. I'll get back with you. It doesn't mean you're going to, take the next step or anything. We could just do a consultation and we can just go from there. Because I mean, the best thing is if I can educate the moms, and we got a diagnosis here. So I've got 3 or 4 peer-reviewed research articles that really aren't available in the medical school curriculum, because I went back there just to check that out. Not there. If I can give those to the moms, then send them into their providers. They will read them. And then that provider learning that one thing could help hundreds and hundreds of kids. It's not just, this is like you said, this is a ripple effect. It's embers that are going to slowly spread and then hopefully erupt upwards, because when people have tried to hit it head on with those people, it's not gone well for them. So
well, this whole podcast is about giving hope to people who are feeling hopeless. And the most important thing is what you're doing is literally going to make a generational change. We are working to help our children, our grandchildren, our great-grandchildren, because if we can shine a light on this and start creating those changes, we can definitely start helping our children. So definitely you guys are going to want to grab her books, go to the website. If you have questions and you feel like you've gotten that crazy label and you're afraid to speak up to your doctor anymore, like there is hope for you. Reach out and ask Elizabeth or her team at how you can start making that change for your child, because you are worth fighting for and so are they. Thank you so much, Elizabeth, for being on. I could literally talk to you for hours. This was so fascinating.
And I have so much to say for hours and hours, so I'll just stop.
Thank you so much for being on the show today.
Thank you, Jana.
Thanks for listening to the Oh My Health, There Is Hope podcast. Make sure to visit Jana's website, bestholisticlife.com, where you can subscribe to the show on iTunes, Google Play, or listen there, so you'll never miss an episode. While you're at it, if you found value in the show, we'd appreciate a rating on iTunes, or if you simply tell a friend about the show, that'll help too. Let's change the world together, one health expert at a time. Looking forward to seeing you next time.